Greetings and welcome to a special conversation, live with the Laureate. We are honored to welcome an award-winning environmental journalist, Andy Revkin, who's interviewing the 2022 World Food Prize laureate, Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig. She will receive the World Food Prize on October 20th in Des Moines, Iowa. Today, you will hear more about her amazing career and get to understand how her work brings together climate, agriculture, and economic models to help farmers and policymakers plan for the impacts of climate change. Andrew and Cynthia will share their perspectives on the triple threat of climate, COVID, and conflict, and the dramatic impacts of these food shocks on all of us, but especially on the hungry and the most vulnerable. Additionally, you'll hear more about our overall objective to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And now, it's my honor to introduce to you Andy Revkin and this year's World Food Prize laureate, Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig.
Greetings, I'm Andy Revkin. I run a communication and innovation and impact initiative at Columbia University's Climate School, and it's an honor to be part of the rollout of the World Food Prize announcement, especially because a colleague, Cynthia Rosenzweig, someone I've known literally half my life, and it's getting to be a longish life, who I can't imagine anyone and any project more worthy of the award. Cynthia Rosenzweig is a senior research scientist at Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which is tucked in next to Columbia here in New York City. And here, we've been at this so long. It's great to see an award like this for your work. What does it do for you to have this laureate announcement, and what can it do for your work?
I'm so honored to receive the World Food Prize this year because food is really emerging as a key issue and area, sector, activity in climate change. We cannot solve climate change unless we address greenhouse gas emissions coming from food. At the same time, we can't ensure food security for all unless we develop resilience to the changing climate that's already happening and is projected to exacerbate in the future.
It's one of the most profound basic activities of humanity is feeding itself. And the energy consequences of our development this past century have created this pulse of change in that climate system. The work you've done really gets at this sort of interlaced aspect of this, which is great. Let's go back to that time, though, 1988, when there were 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, and now it's 412, or it's hard to keep track. Back then, there were about 7 billion people, and actually not even yet 7 billion people. Now we're heading toward 9, and so many things are in flux. But what I wanted to do is find out, what got you going before we get into the climate system?
I fell in love with agriculture in Italy because my husband-to-be and I, when we were in our young 20s, moved to Tuscany to farm there. He had done an anthropology project with a family in the Chianti region of Tuscany. He told me about it, and I said, we have to go do that. So we moved to Italy. We rented one of those brown houses with the red tile roofs. The first morning, a neighbor came with a spade, a special hoe, to teach us how to make our garden. That was the moment I fell in love with agriculture.
When did you make that transition to the climate component? You ended up at NASA in the early 80s.
Yes.
When I was at the journalism school up the block, Columbia, and how did you migrate there?
When we came back to the United States to pursue our education, my husband started his PhD at NYU in economics, and I decided that I wanted to start back at the beginning and study agriculture. And so started back first, a technical college, Farmingdale on Long Island. Then, what's the closest place to New York City where you can actually then get your degree in agriculture? It's Rutgers. Right. So I started down there. We had small children. And up here, Goddard Institute for Space Studies and NASA were doing analyses of remote sensing of agricultural scenes.
Right.
So they came to Rutgers and they said, we need a graduate student. And so this worked perfectly for me because I lived in New York City. So I started there and I did work with on remote sensing first, But then, at the same time, our institute is the home and was under development, was one of the first global climate models, making the projections of those 350 parts per million CO2, and the doubling of that. So sometimes it was 300 to 600. The director, Jim Hanson, a very well-known climate scientist, it turns out is from Iowa. And this question from Jim came filtering down. He's on the top floor. I'm like, like on the air shaft, way down on the second or third floor. The question that filtered down was, what will happen to food with these projections of the climate change? What an
amazing, profound moment that would have been. In other words, it's sort of one of those, by the way, can we feed ourselves in a warming world?
Exactly. Yeah. And so in my career, I've been so privileged to be working on answering that question ever since.
And that's where we intersected. And I was, as we said earlier, I was at the journalism school getting going in journalism. I had a science degree in biology, and I saw this issue percolating, climate change. I did my first big story on it was about nuclear winter, the opposite. If we chilled the Earth, 1985. And then 1988 in New York City and across Iowa and across much of the Northern Hemisphere, we had baking heat. Yellowstone National Park was on fire. There was a big impact on agriculture. And I came to the Goddard Institute and started talking to people. And this article, which you probably have seen before, resulted my first big cover story on global warming. And that set me on my learning journey ever since. Let's talk about models, because models are a key to a lot of this. We've had all kinds of tools in science going back. You dig down to the earth, get the past. You look at the current situation by studying a plant in a greenhouse or whatever. And then we have to project forward, and that's where math comes in. And you had I think your father was a mathematician too, but so tell us, how do you create a model that reliably can give us some picture of where crops will go in this heating future?
We use crop models, and the models represent the processes of crop growth. It's a set of mathematical relationships that takes the inputs from the sun, solar radiation, precipitation, we have the temperature, we have the soil and the water from the soil, and we plant a seed in the computer, and then those equations every day with the inputs grow the roots, grow the shoots, grow the leaves, grow the stalks, and the grain.
It's amazing. And then you have to figure out a way to integrate that with this grand model of the ocean's atmosphere, and land and ice.
Right. So those models were available under development, and I went and found the people who had developed those models, Joe Ritchie and Jim Jones, and I said, these models are perfect for answering Jim's question, for answering the question of how the projected climate change would affect crops. A very important thing about the models also is not only do they have the climate inputs onto the crops, but they have the carbon dioxide, the CO2 as well. And because you have to do both things, so we do it in current, so we do simulations with those models for the current climate, and then we do scenarios of the future climate and the future CO2 concentrations. And that's why the models are so great, because they integrate the responses of both of those key changes.
There were two key papers that underpin your journey through this stage. One was in '85 on wheat, North America, I think. And then '94, you went global. Can you just quickly describe that journey from the one paper to the next, and what new challenges emerged in trying to do something global?
My first peer-reviewed journal article was in 1985 in the journal Climatic Change, and it took the projections coming from the GISS climate model, and it was an expert system. It was a different kind of model. The model that we used, that I developed there, was an expert system to give the rules for where different kinds of wheat can grow. And so I made this expert system for what were the climate requirements for those different kinds of crops, and saw that that's where they were grown in the current, and then took the climate change projections and made a map of where these regions would move because it's getting warmer in the north.
Right.
So those southern varieties were moving to the north.
And I think this was pretty early days. You hand drew this
Yeah,
map?
yeah. So that actually, I'll tell the story about then moving to global.
Yeah.
So the EPA asked my colleague in the UK, Martin Parry, and I to lead a study on how the climate model projections, those, and we call them scenarios, would be affecting the crops worldwide.
Right.
So one of the key things about modeling is that it's a tool for learning. And so it's not just the model, it's the model and the modeler.
For sure.
And what are we learning? What are we surprised about?
Right,
so
right.
The due date came, everybody had done the same scenarios, and they started sending in their results. And we made a hand-drawn map. And for yield decreases, we put yellows, oranges, and browns. And as the results from the developing countries came in, we saw in the lower latitudes where most developing countries are, that's where those yellows, oranges, and browns were concentrated.
Right.
And this is really one of the very, very key lessons of climate change impacts is that the developing countries are more vulnerable to the changes.
Yeah, and of course the other reality is that they're least responsible for the emissions that are driving the change, which takes us to the realm of how this all plays into policy. The other parallel track through this time was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the treaty process started in 1992 in Rio. When this diplomacy and policy journey was intensifying, even as the models were being developed, was there a sense that this was an easy fit, or were people resisting what was coming out of the models? How did that play out? When was the first time you really were in that diplomacy part of the picture?
Well, let's start with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC,
Right.
because I've been involved almost from the beginning, because that's really where the scientists put their work and come together to assess all the literature. And then that IPCC, those IPCC assessment reports are then really then the foundation, the science foundation for the diplomatic and country negotiators who are debating how to respond as a
Right.
global body, and then individual countries. So the IPCC, I've worked on the impacts chapter and the agriculture chapters there. I worked on observed impacts. So that's a key thing. So all this modeling,
Right.
very important. But I also said we have to look to see, are any of these effects happening already? So for the fourth assessment report, I led the chapter on observed impacts. It was the first time there had been a chapter on what are the physical changes, like hydrology changes or water resources, but there are biological ecosystem changes,
Right.
like birds migrating earlier, laying eggs earlier. And there were very few on agriculture because agriculture is an adapted system. Farmers are not going to sit around
Right.
and wait for the climate to change and then not change what they do.
Right.
They're very smart. You know, there's an expression, there are no dumb farmers.
Right.
So because agriculture is this very mixed system, physical, biological, and socioeconomic, it's harder to actually nail those changes. That was in the early days. Now, with increases in extreme events that we've been having since around 2000, there are now very clear examples on food production.
Was there a point in this entwined journey of policy, action, and the science when you felt traction is happening finally?
In that, agriculture is a very, very specific and special sector, as you were saying, because it's in every single country in the world. And it's also, in a way, the primary and fundamental sector. And so countries, I think, feel very proud of their agriculture and very protective. And so I think that those are some of the reasons why ag and food have not been as much on the table up until now. But that's changing now.
Partially because the impacts are there,
Yes.
or?
Yes, for a couple of reasons. One is that with work that we've been doing with a colleague at FAO and then others in other labs, scientists have been calculating across the entire food system the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just agriculture in the field anymore, it's all the supply chain, transportation, energy use, and then the role in the consumption side and retail, and then food loss and waste.
Sure.
So the new work is showing that the food system as a whole is responsible for 1/3 of the human-caused greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
And this is why also now that we say food needs to be on the table in the solutions.
In the mitigation of emissions.
Yes,
yeah.
for the mitigation of emissions.
I wanted to ask
Yeah.
you about AgMIP, and if you could deconstruct it a little bit. As an observer of this process, I think a lot of people, when they think about communication around climate, you're thinking about telling a better story. But if you're talking about the solutions or understanding the interlaced problems, it's about holding better conversations. How have you dealt with being at the interface of practitioners, economists, climatologists, running, as you said, some who just want to make their models more sophisticated? So what's it like to build something like AgMIP that has all these different voices at the table?
Well, first, those different fields, climate, biologists, agronomists, and animal scientists, and economists, they don't often speak the same language.
I know.
Their understanding of the word model, we've been talking a lot about models.
Yeah.
So we were talking about the climate models, we were talking about the crop models, but the economists have their whole, the equilibrium and all the different kinds of models that they use. Right. From the very beginning in 2010, which was the kickoff workshop of AgMIP, we invited the economists to be there. And one of the economists had to leave early, and he came and he walked by me and he whispered to me and he said, "Cynthia, don't worry, the economists will be with you." And they have. And we have a fantastic global economics team, 10 to 15 of the global trade models that are used. They're not used only for climate change. These are what governments are using around the world for testing policies, for example. So I think that because we had this interdisciplinary approach from the beginning. And we don't, by the way, also, we don't make one big model of everything. A big part of AgMIP, a founding principle, is what we call the multi-model approach.
And that's the word intercomparison.
That's the intercomparison part. Two very important things. One, what we found from the multi-model approach is that, and by the way, the climate modelers found this as well, that the mean of all these model results, let's say on, this is first, you always see how are they doing on the current, right? We don't just go off into the future blindly.
Right.
Does a better job predicting what is actually happening in the fields than any of the individual models.
Right.
So there's this group, this great group resource if we bring the models together and use them in this way. And this is a very, very key part of it.
So the AgMIP acronym, it's just say the words again, agricultural?
Agricultural model, and the I stands for two things. Intercomparison, so that's this multi-model ensemble approach, and improvement, because we have to keep improving the models. We can't keep using the same old models. We'll never learn anything new. And we have to with climate change because it's so complex.
Right, and I think, to me, a lot of people, I think, expect environmental problems to be simpler than this. Pollution that came out of smokestacks, the Clean Air Act came around, there's less pollution of the kind that directly harms people. Smog got cleaned up to a certain extent. Other countries, it's still a huge problem. Climate change has these dimensions. The fact that it's so interlaced with all energy needs, a growing human population, and how we feed ourselves, get water. It's a new phenomenon, it's emergent, and this idea of having an iterative approach to comparing models, driving conversations, that word improvement is really key, I think, and I hope people understand that. One thing that also leads to is that no generation, either of journalists or scientists or energy technologists or farmers, solves this problem. So how do you convey, or what do you say to the next generation of Cynthias? What are the needs going forward that might be different than the way things have been so far?
First of all, there's just so many great young people coming into the field, more than ever before. Food is becoming this kind of a magnet for young people of in all different areas. What we need now are systems modelers, because what you were just describing is really this complex system of things connecting. And the work will be, I think, how do we work to understand the system and the solutions better? And that's where I would direct young people. And AgMIP does that.
Yeah.
When we do projects in countries around the world, of which we've done in about 20 countries. They're the senior researchers, and then the graduate students, and sometimes undergraduates as well. So their undergraduate work and their master's thesis or their PhD thesis can then come from the AgMIP methods that we're developing and that we're using in that project.
So let's get back to this COP journey, the conferences of the parties since 1992, and our parallel courses reporting and working on this problem. COP26 just happened in Glasgow, and now we're heading toward one in Egypt, COP27, where a lot of the focus will be on developing country and African needs. Can you describe your work through that process? Last year,
COP26 was in Glasgow. For agriculture and food, there was some progress. Some announcements, for example, on U.S.-China work on methane, which in agriculture was mentioned there, and some language on agriculture and land use. But right now, in preparation for COP27 in Egypt, many groups who work in agriculture are really coming together to energize a much greater attention to food and agriculture at the COP.
Good.
I think part of it is because Egypt is in Africa, and the vulnerability of the agriculture and food production and food systems in Africa is very real. And what we in AgMIP are doing is working to provide the countries with the information, the evidence they need to be able to decide what's right for their country in terms of their nationally determined commitments to greenhouse gas reductions, right, their national adaptation plans. And it's by providing the results of these protocol-based projects that we then working with, and we work with national stakeholders to say, what do you need? What kind of information do you need for your decision? So sometimes we call it, especially our work in the countries around the world, stakeholder-driven regional integrated assessments, because we can be doing it in what we think is right. So then we bring in social scientists. For example, in Bangladesh, we have a project right now in Bangladesh, and we held over Zoom a meeting with about 20 national stakeholders, people who are developing their and the NDCs and the national adaptation plans for their countries. And that's how the science really still, I believe, is the foundation for the progress at the negotiations.
The world is in the midst of two layered crises right now. A pandemic, which completely disrupted supply chains for so many things. And along comes Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is Ukraine being a key source of wheat for Northern Africa, for Egypt and other countries. Can you just say how this work you do with AgMIP and how you personally think about the climate problem when we're consumed also with these current crises and the prospects for hunger in Northern Africa from the wheat shortfalls are probably enormous, plus other impacts. So how does that play out?
We now have triple threats, but they're not threats, they're happening. Climate is changing.
Right.
Many extreme events are getting to be more frequent, more intense. Then, for the past, we're now in our third year of the coronavirus pandemic, and now we have conflict in the Ukraine. And what these three huge forces coming together mean is a much greater probability of food shocks, what we call food shocks. So we have extreme events, for example, heat wave in Russia in 2010, 2011 with the food price spike at that time. With COVID, there was supply chain disruption. There was also farm labor disruption. Right. That out in the fields, there was disruption for farm labor. There was also disruption within, for example, meat packing factories. Just multiple interactions with the food system with COVID. And AgMIP did a project in Zimbabwe with that to look at the interactions of climate change and COVID. And now we have the conflict in Ukraine. It's one of the wheat baskets of the world.
Right. And
in Russia, fertilizer manufacturing.
Right.
Manufacture. Prices of wheat have already gone up 20 to 40%, and combining wheat and fertilizer, 20 to 40%. This is already happening. So the World Food Program, FAO, and others are really sounding the alarm that all these three things coming together can really spell increased hunger, not just in the future, but really in the coming year.
It's pretty scary.
Yeah.
So the communication frontier now is complicated. Social media can make a lot of noise around issues. Oh, it's just a model. Or, there was a wave of skepticism that I think has faded. But what's the upside of connectedness through these media that sometimes we feel are overwhelming when it comes to things like getting that farmer information that they need critically, on a year-to-year basis? Do you see that being a part of this too?
Very much so. So one of the things that we've done in AgMIP is we've created the AgMIP Impacts Explorer. It's an online tool that farmers can use, decision makers can use, and coming from those projects. So we are all for it. But Andy, really, we need to work with people like you who really know how to do it.
Don't assume anything. It's all a new frontier. I mean, it's another emergent reality.
It is. It's an emergent reality.
But
I think, that absolutely we need to, and very much we want to. If farmers, I think, if farmers using apps and using AgMIP results in apps, we would love to develop some apps like that.
To get data flowing as well.
And a two-way street, that's right,
Sure.
the two-way street. So it's, and then getting the data from the farmers and then doing kind of real-time analysis and then back. I know a lot of groups are working on that kind of thing, and AgMIP would love to get into that as well.
What does success look like to you? Knowing that this is an iterative journey, it's not like or do you feel like there's a finish line? But what does success look like to you in 2050 or so?
there's no finish line because climate change will continue, even if we restrain it, according to the Paris Agreement, down to the target of 1.5 degrees C, which is very challenging. But even then, there will be changes and that the food system will be dealing with. So, but in terms of how we could, I would say, feel positive that we're making progress in the two sides of the food and climate street. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the food system. From the supply side, in the fields, growing in the fields, reducing clearing of land for agriculture, more efficient production in which there's less carbon, more product, less carbon.
Right.
And then through the supply chains, all that using low carbon energy sources. So that's the supply side. Then on the demand side, there is the potential for using our circular food system approach to change where places have, such as in developed countries, where people have choices about their food, to go more towards plant-based diets. We have to be really, really careful about statements about diets.
Right.
Because food environments, that's a new term that my nutrition colleagues use. It's always context specific. And because we have to have equity in mind. And a wonderful phrase, I believe, a really important phrase, just transitions. So when we think about this trajectory to 2050, so we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions throughout the whole food system. We have to have resilient food production for these extreme events, which are getting worse, right? And the transitions have to be just, because farming is a livelihood, and all through the food system, it's people's livelihoods. I think it's about 1 billion people who work in the food system.
Right.
So we can't just be changing everything and then people not having jobs. It can't be that way. So this just transition approach in food, just food transitions, is also absolutely critical. But people are starting to really think deeply about these issues and solutions. And it is such an enormous amount of people working in climate change and food. And because I interact with so many different people in all different parts of the system, everyone is getting going and working on solutions. So it's getting going. I want to say one more thing.
Sure.
Tipping points. So here's, in climate science, and at Goddard Institute for Space Studies, I'm surrounded by some of the best climate scientists in the world.
Yep.
And one of the things that some of them work on is tipping points. So it's these processes that sort of start slowly. This is like the ice sheets, right? Melting here and there, doing this, right? And then at a certain level of warming, that process accelerates, right? There's a tipping point. I really believe that for solutions to climate change, there will be tipping points too. Tipping points in solutions.
Sure.
And that we don't know what they will be. That's why we have to get going. And there have to be mitigation packages. And in AgMIP, we'd help the countries develop adaptation packages. But there need to be mitigation packages too.
Right.
But then we see what's working. And look, we all know about things going viral, right?
Yeah, sure.
So that's also why, I feel that we can restrain the climate change. We can't, it's not exactly solving it, but it's restraining it enough so that we can really then provide the food security for all.
That's a great vision. And I hope there's one thing you seem to have also, which is this boundless capacity for enthusiasm and energy, and I know you mentioned farmers, and you mentioned their resilience and adaptability and innovative capacity. I don't know if there's been specific moments when you've seen an insight or an innovation that really excites you out in the world where that food system sits.
Yes. Before COVID, I participated in a climate change and food program in Des Moines, Iowa, where the World Food Prize is located. Right. And there were the state ag secretary, folks who works with the state, professors from Iowa State over in Ames, and there was a panel of farmers. And those farmers work closely with the professors, using their farms as living laboratories for solutions. Like bringing back, remember those strip farmers, the strip contours that we learned about in 5th grade, right? Well, now they've taken that so much farther. What are the right things to plant, how to do it? And so one farmer was testing that with a professor at Iowa State. And other farmers were testing improved pastures, and it was inspiring. Then in developing countries, so AgMIP works in about 20 countries, and we would hold our project workshops in different countries, a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. And we would always plan a field trip. And the modelers would be saying, no, we have to keep staying, and we need to work on our computers. And I would say, no, we must go out to the field, because in the end of the day, it's out in the field that this is actually all happening. And so then our local hosts, would again take us to farmers, often working with scientists, to be working on soil carbon sequestration, greenhouse, efficient, low energy greenhouse production, testing out agricultural biodiversity. There's work showing that rather than going with monoculture fields, that having different crops, different varieties, can be more resilient to the increasing climate extremes. So we saw examples of all of those for example, in Senegal and Ghana and Zimbabwe and Kenya, and you see, and that's also why I'm not pessimistic, because I interact with so many groups and people that are working on solutions, or on solving and evolving and transforming the agriculture system.
So what's next for AgMIP?
Right now, AgMIP is developing a program that's called Mitigation and Adaptation Co-Benefits. The acronym is MACB, the short name. Okay. Because, Andy, you can see from our discussion, there's been a lot of work on mitigation in agriculture, a whole group of folks doing it separately and siloed from the adaptation and resilience folks. But in agriculture and food, these things are actually integrated. Right. So, for example, soil carbon sequestration. It can, done right, in the right context, with the right measurements, sequester carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But also, when you have more soil carbon, when farmers have it in their soil, it improves water retention during drought. It actually then is more of a sponge with the heavy rainfalls that are already happening. And so you see, it's combined. Yeah. So what AgMIP is now doing with MACB is we're bringing together the mitigation models and the adaptation models. Sometimes it can be done in the same model. So for example, in rice model, there's been work in rice modeling already. So we have one model that we're using for our Bangladesh MACB project. But it's also okay if we just do them side by side, but utilizing the same scenarios,
Sure.
and the protocols, and then bringing the results together. That's the first step. And all with stakeholder interaction in the beginning, middle, and end, so that these co-benefits the evidence on the co-benefits, and there may be trade-offs, by the way. Where do they not work together?
Knowing
right?
that is important.
It's
Right.
just as important. So we
learned that with biofuels, and
exactly.
there are many instances where there was
Exactly.
like, oh, that's not gonna work.
Exactly.
Right.
But this modeling approach, and we use regional economic models too, so that we see what's happening with the livelihoods, because always food security and livelihoods have to be always from the beginning, right? So that then working with those national stakeholders, they can really then develop the programs quicker, because the models can do it quicker than doing these kinds of experiments out in the field. So we want to see what's working. We can test a lot more things, then maybe speed up the experimental work. So we're just this MACB project has just been selected to be a flagship project of the Global Research Alliance, which has over 70 countries as members. And so we're very much hoping to expand this program throughout the world.
It's fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to you getting this honor later this year, and also to the next Cynthia Rosenzweigs who come forward. Wherever they are in the world, you're a great model for people to emulate going. And also, I'm thinking back to the work of Daniel Hillel, who was also a World Food Prize recipient a long time ago, on precise irrigation. Every one of these steps has the potential to create progress, and sharing them, the communication aspect is key too. So I'm grateful to have been part of being able to share your story.
Andy, thank you so much. And yes, thank you for recalling Daniel Hillel. Daniel Hillel was a very important mentor for me. And that going out to the field is something that he taught me, for example. But he was a modeler, but he was an experimentalist, he was a modeler, and he taught me that you have to always be going back and forth between what you learn from the real systems and then the use of the models, which can help you then scale up. So yes, and it's a great honor for me to be following in his footsteps, getting the prize, because I think he got it 10 years ago.
Bravo.
Thank you, Andy.
Our thanks to both Andrew and Cynthia. We hope you found this discussion both educational and inspiring. I'm standing in the Ruan Laureates room in front of a beautiful ceramic tile portrait commemorating our first female World Food Prize laureate, Dr. Evangelina Viegas. She received the World Food Prize in 2000. It will be my honor to present the World Food Prize to another woman laureate on October 20th. So plan to join us for the International Borlaug Dialogue in Des Moines, Iowa from October 18th to the 20th. Registration for the dialogue will open in June, so watch for that launch. We are planning a robust program for both in-person and virtual participation. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you'll view more about the 2022 World Food Prize laureate at our website, worldfoodprize.org.